Good evening, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to Dominican University. I am Rachel Hart-Winner, the director of the Siena Center, and I am delighted to welcome you to our second event in our semester-long series, which celebrates our 10th anniversary as a center. Before we begin with our evening lecture, I want to draw your attention to our program. If you open it to the second page, you can see a list of our upcoming events. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to our mini-course offerings, which begin next week. And I'd invite all of you to consider joining us and spending some time enriching your own theological and intellectual mind with some of our wonderful professors. So if you have questions or would like to sign up, please see me after, and I'd be happy to help you get set. Now, to our main event. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Miguel Diaz, University Professor of Faith and Culture at the University of Dayton and former ambassador to the Holy See. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See from 2009 to 2012. Miguel was the first theologian and the first Hispanic to hold this post. He is a true visionary. While ambassador, he helped to launch the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. The working group facilitates regular dialogue between U.S. foreign policymakers and religious leaders, scholars, and practitioners worldwide. They devise strategies to build more effective partnerships on issues such as conflict prevention and humanitarian assistance. These topics are certainly of great importance to our world and closely connected to our own Dominican motto of building a more just and humane world. Prior to Miguel's appointment to the Vatican, he taught theology at the College of St. Benedict in St. Joseph, Minnesota, and St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. He was a board member of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is a former president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. Last year, Miguel received the Virgilio Elizondo Award for Distinguished Achievement in Theology. So we know he is quite renowned in his field. He was born in Cuba and came to the U.S. while still young. He earned his PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame. Miguel is co-editor of the book, From the Heart of Our People, Explorations in Catholic Systematic Theology. He also wrote the book On Being Human, U.S. Hispanic and Ranierian Perspectives. Miguel's scholarship, commitment, and faith help all of us creatively imagine the role of the theologian, the civil servant, and the university. He has a talent for articulating a Christian view of the person, with special attention to Hispanic theologians and their accumulated wisdom and experience. Tonight, we are so fortunate to hear Miguel explore the role of community, reminding us all that we truly are a people who become with others. Please join me in welcoming to Dominican University a man of prayer and scholarship, a man of great intellectual and spiritual energy, a man of true joy and wisdom, Dr. Miguel Diaz.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to start by thanking a few persons here this evening. The president, of course, Madam President, Donna Carroll, thank you for being here. Also, Claire, and of course, Rachel, in the Siena Center for issuing this invitation. And all of you who have come this evening. I thought I was not going to make it. I sat at the airport in Dayton, Ohio for 4 hours while planes kept being delayed. The flight originated from Chicago, and there were technical difficulties as well as weather-related delays. But I'm here. So it is good to be with you here in the Windy City. So I want to start with a little story. When I first arrived in Rome as the 9th U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, I was in for a change of lifestyle, to put it mildly. But my first official trip out of Rome, the Dominicans will appreciate this, was actually to Roca Seca. So I went to the birthplace of Thomas Aquinas' town, and I was given a complete tour, including of the castle that is in ruins, where Thomas Aquinas' father, put him in there for some time. And so my dissertation director at Notre Dame is a Dominican, Mary Catherine Hirkert, and one of my other advisors is a Dominican, Tom O'Mara. So I think, and then I grew up in Miami with the Adrian Dominicans. My brother was baptized as Saint Dominic. And so I think I have enough of the Dominicans in me to stand here with you and say I'm a member of the family. So tonight I'm going to speak to you about we are a people. We the people who become with others, and try to attempt a theological reading of a Pluribus Unum. I've been doing a lot of bridge building between my diplomatic recent service and my theological background. I'm currently writing a book entitled Building Bridges, God, Diplomacy, and the Common Good, and editing a series for Orbis Press on Catholicism and the Common Good. In his world-renowned classic, Le Petit Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry tells the story of a little prince who embarks on a journey of self-discovery. Those of us familiar with this story can recall his valuable insights related to the proper exercise of power, the sharing of human and natural resources. It stands against conformity and is strong support for creaturely interdependence. The central theme of this story is about human nature and its ability to develop through sight. A wise fox clearly delivers this message and proposes to the little prince the secret to life. Voici mon secret. Il est très simple. On ne voit pas bien qu'avec le cœur. L'essentiel est invisible pour les yeux. C'est le temps que tu as perdu pour ta rose qui fait ta rose qu'aussi importante. Behold my secret, observes the fox. It is quite simple. We do not see well except through the heart. That which is essential is invisible to the eyes. It is the time that you have spent with your rose that has made your rose so important. Time, care, and relationship with others. Herein lays the secret to becoming authentically human. This year-long series at Dominican University explores the central question, who are we now? It's a fitting question to consider at a time of great economic unrest, religious intolerance, unprecedented climate changes, unresolved conflicts around the globe, and the polarization that plagues our nation. In a world that grows closer together as a result of globalization and interdependence, yet paradoxically draws apart as a result of fearing others and their distinct otherness, the question, who are we, with respect to the persons, communities, and nations that surround us, has never been more crucial to raise. As human creatures, we share a common past and face a common future with all creatures that abide on our planet. The secret to meeting these challenges, as the white fox and the little prince suggests, is to take time to cultivate and care for the earth and the creatures that share our common ground. In this lecture, I will reflect upon three foundations that shape our identity as American Catholics. 1. The American principle, e pluribus unum. 2. The biblical story of our origins, namely found in the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. And 3, the most cherished doctrine of Christian faith, the doctrine of the Trinity. Well, the American principle, E Pluribus Unum, offers building blocks to construct a proper understanding of who we are as a nation. The book of Genesis and the doctrine of the Trinity can build upon the central insights associated with our lived national experience and the ideals associated with this principle to offer a Christian theological correlation. As Catholics, we must never cease to engage in ongoing critical conversations with our cultural heritage, especially as we seek to build bridges within an increasingly pluralistic American society. In this sense, Thomas Aquinas' axiom that faith does not destroy what is authentically human, but presupposes and completes it, serves as my guiding theological principle. Mindful of this axiom, this lecture explores the central question of human identity, who are we, by building upon our American principle, E Pluribus Unum, both from biblical and doctrinal perspectives. First, our foundational American principle, E Pluribus Unum. Almost 4 years ago in Cairo, President Obama recalled that the United States of America was, quote, founded upon the ideal that all are created equal, and has struggled for centuries to give meaning to those words within our borders and around our world, end of quote. The president underscored that as Americans, we are shaped by every culture, drawn from every end of the earth, and dedicated to a simple concept, E Pluribus Unum, out of many, one. The United States, as the president has observed in a number of his speeches, is not a fait accompli. The we that comprises our nation is constantly changing and transforming our national identity in ways that strive to meet the ideals set forth by our founders. We, the people, are diverse and ever-changing, even as we struggle to live up to the ideal of Lady Liberty to welcome new immigrants to our shores from every corner of this earth. A rich diversity shapes the American landscape. Just take a look around here. It's enough. A recent demographical study unveiled that the U.S. is about to reach a demographic milestone where no single ethnic community will command a majority. Today, in our country, 1 in 7 new marriages are interracial or interethnic. There's little doubt that Americans hail from every corner of this globe. And this changing phase in American society, especially within the Catholic Church, is increasingly associated with Latinos, whose influential presence in the pews and in the voting booth can no longer be suppressed. The rich cultural and racial diversity, while challenging in many ways, also offers enormous opportunities. Just imagine the kind of witness we as Americans can offer the world if we manage to create one nation through greater inclusion of and preferential care for the poor and marginalized who live among the many. Pierre-Eugène de Saumetière proposed the motto E Pluribus Unum to those responsible for developing the Great Seal of our nation at the time of the American Revolution. The 13 letters in the Latin phrase E Pluribus Unum originally suggested the 13 colonies out of which our one nation took shape. According to the U.S. Treasury, the first U.S. coinage of this principle took place in 1795. In more recent times, this principle has been used to affirm the struggle to shape our nation out of the God-given dignity and rights that all people deserve to have, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, or any other human condition. Whether we think of Seneca Falls, Selma, or Stonewall, to name but a few of the many struggles to affirm human dignity in this country, it is clear that we, the people, continue to reflect upon, update, and translate into meaningful ways our foundational model out of many one, a pluribus unum. The affirmation that unity and oneness presupposes diversity is, of course, not an idea that emerges with the birth of our nation. Indeed, ancient philosophers were fascinated with the question of difference in the world and offered various arguments that address possible ways of reconciling this diversity. Classical philosophy captures this interest in its manifold attempts to reconcile the one with the many. Being with a capital B and beings with the lowercase b. Indeed, the principle of a pluribus unum can already be found in Heraclitus' 10th fragment in the 6th century BCE. Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic philosopher who addressed questions of plurality, oneness, and the origins of all beings within the world. For Heraclitus, quote, "The one is made up of all things, and all things issue from the one." Various versions of this principle continue to be found in the writings of ancient philosophers and Christian theologians. Perhaps most notable among Christian writers is Augustine, who in his Confessions uses this principle to argue for the oneness that emerges out of manifold human expressions that draw friends together. Thus Augustine writes, and I quote St. Augustine, "Those and the like expressions proceeding out of the hearts of those that loved and were loved again, by the countenance, the tongue, the eyes, and the thousand pleasing gestures, were so much fuel to melt our souls together, and out of many make but one." End of quote. It's from Book 4 of the Confessions. And so I pose the following questions for us to consider tonight. What if we saw this American principle as a vestige of our Christian identity? What if this secular way of capturing our national identity contained within its seeds of wisdom, grace-filled insights regarding the communal nature of our creaturely identity? In other words, what would a theological reading of this principle look like? What if we read our natural, national, and ordinary historical attempts to realize oneness as diversity from the eyes of faith? How would that reading correlate with essential arguments contained within our sacred texts and most cherished theological traditions? Surely, the affirmation that we were created in God's image and that the one God exists out of a diverse communion of persons remains the most central claim of our Christian faith. This theological perspective resonates well with, and to some extent provides a broader and more fundamental cultural context for reflection upon our personal and national identity. A foundational biblical story shaping our human identity then and now. Genesis and creation in God's image. Sallust, a Roman historian in the 1st century, rightly argued that a myth has never happened. It happens every day. Genesis 2 and 3 is a biblical myth that addresses a profound and perennial truth about who God is, who we are called to become, and how we are called to exist in community. This narrative offers central insights related to the nature of human identity that resonate well with, build upon, and more fundamentally capture the meaning of the principle in Pluribus Unum. This second story of creation tells the story of creatures originating from a common origin, namely God and the earth. The sexual differentiation that God brings about in the human creature signals the fundamental need for diversity among humans who share this common origin. Without difference, the human creature cannot overcome loneliness. And as the male differentiated earth creature makes clear, human differences give rise to self-knowledge and self-realization. Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Life and death is the subject of the second story of creation. Life, eros. Eros means unity, fulfillment, harmony, mutuality, delight. Life is diversity. On the other hand, death, thanatos, results in the suppression of, in the melting away of human differences. I'm going to pause here and say I gave a speech for an international conference in Barcelona as the American ambassador commemorating the Bosnian wars in Sarajevo. And I used a provocative expression. I said, I don't like too much the idea that the United States is the melting pot. I much rather say that the United States is like a paella. A rich seafood dish that contains various ingredients that contribute to the wonderful flavor that comes about. And without the shrimp, without the chicken, without the saffron rice, you just don't have a paella. You don't melt away these differences. You cherish them. You value them. You bring them to the table so that they can contribute to the common good. Genesis, life is about that. Preservation of differences. Death, on the other hand, is the melting away of differences. It means discourse, strife, hostility, danger, and division. It is disintegration and the breaking of harmonious limits. As a result of death, mutuality yields to inequality, and oneness yields to sameness. Oneness yields to sameness. Oneness is not the same thing as sameness. Life loses to death, but not indefinitely, as we know. A number of central insights related to the nature of human existence. Life in community, care of creatures, and the importance of diversity unfold within this story. So consider the following. Just like our nation, right? Creation is a process that unfolds from the goodness of the triune God. This process leads to greater specificity and creaturely differentiation, differences, newness. God sees these differences, and God says, this is very good. God delights in difference. God creates Ha'adam, the earth creature, from Ha'adamav, the earth. Playfulness, right? The reddish-brown substance, the earth, is literally a fertile soil, humus, that is capable of absorbing water, being cultivated and supporting life. Though differing in the creative process, all creatures originate from God, and out of this common fertile ground referred to this earth, the Adamah. A fundamental equality exists between the differentiated human being as male and female. God creates humans as companions on a journey. The playfulness implied in the literary use of the male-female provides a hermeneutic for understanding the right ordering of all human relations among persons. And I take all human relations among persons, so it is the text invites us to conceive all kinds of human relations, regardless of gender, race, cultural, sexual orientation, physical ability, immigration status, or any other category associated with human experiences. We are all children of God, and we are all called to exist in this kind of playfulness and mutuality. So what about the bad part of the story here? The disobedience of God's order of creaturely relations leads to the unnatural ways of relating among human persons. And when that happens, then there's power over others rather than mutuality. Dominion over the earth rather than care of it. Dominion understood in a negative sense. And this is what we in the West call the fallen state. It is when difference becomes division. No longer able to say a pluribus unum at this point. This biblical story of our origins reveals that what is most natural and godlike for humans is in fact to order our lives in ways that respect and embrace creaturely differences. Only through partnering with others do we fulfill the commandment and pleasurable act of tilling and keeping the earth and all its creatures. Conversely, isolation, independence threatens the peaceful coexistence of all creatures and leads to unnatural relations and misuse of power among persons, communities, and nations. In answer to the question, who are we? Genesis answers in a resounding fashion. We are creatures created in God's image who exist from the many, for the many, with the many. Foundational Christian doctrine. God, humans, and becoming through others and their distinct otherness. So my favorite icon is, in the programs, Rootlif's icon of the Trinity. Because it's actually based on Genesis 18. In the visitation of the strangers to the house of Abraham and Sarah, and during this act of hospitality, Abraham and Sarah, it's typical with the stories of the Old Testament. The host-guest relationship is overturned, and here is Abraham and Sarah thinking they're hosting. They actually become the guests of the divine messengers. And in Christian art and theology, but specifically Trinitarian theology, this text is seen as has taken a Trinitarian interpretation of the life of God as a communion of persons. And so that's why this is one of my favorite icons of the Trinity. And so the cornerstone of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is the concept of person. As a result of various theological controversies surrounding the divinity of Christ and the Spirit, Christian theologians in both East and West, and especially the Cappadocian Fathers, articulated a very early on in Christian tradition of sophisticated metaphysics of personhood. Students in the room, metaphysics, the understanding of ontology, being, an ultimate reality. The pivotal move in this direction came in the aftermath of the Arian controversy, when Christian theologians, in order to uphold the full divinity of Christ, affirmed that He originated from the very substance of the Father, the very substance of God, rather than from God's will, as the world and all human creatures originated. This is where we get the famous homoousios clause that those of us that are Catholic are familiar with, and some other Christian traditions, one in being of the same substance with the Father. The affirmation that Jesus Christ is homoousios with God, that is of the same nature of the Father, allow Christians to understand the divine substance, or ousia, as possessing a relational nature, a concrete impersonal existence. This move not only enabled Christian theology to understand personhood, that is, the personhood of God the Father as the cause of all beings, human and divine, but also offered greater clarity in being able to distinguish between what is particular in God, hypostasis, and what is shared in God, ousia. This ontology of personhood carries enormous implications for a Christian answer to the question, who are we? In the image of divine persons, the call of human persons is to exist for and from others. In the image of the one God who exists as many, the preservation of human differences is essential to realize any attempt to realize unity at local, national, or international contexts. The Christian doctrine of God stands and falls upon the notion that unity comes through the preservation of difference rather than its suppression. God is, in the absolute and ontological sense of the term, the one who exists out of the many, Father, Son, and Spirit. As John Sisoulas, a contemporary Orthodox theologian, has argued, and he has a great book called Communion and Otherness, John Sisoulas argues, the first thing that emerges from a study of the doctrine of the Trinity is that otherness is constitutive of unity and not consequent upon it. In other words, it's not that you have first one and then the many, but no, the otherness, difference, in God, in the absolute sense of the term, is essential. Either God exists as a communion of distinct persons, or God doesn't exist at all from a Christian perspective. Difference is essential in the life of God. Thus, while God's life expresses the highest and most perfect degree of sociality, unity in God does not come at the expense of erasing the necessary and distinct participation of each of the divine persons in the common life of God. Relationship is not simply a choice that humans make, an added-on experience that merely supplements an already existing human identity. Rather, to be a person is to become with others. The birth and ongoing survival, so the birth and ongoing survival, I'm using these terms very, very carefully, of human and divine personhood occurs within and through a web of relationships. In this sense, it is not the thinking ego, Descartes' je pense donc je suis, I think therefore I am, that gives rise to personhood, nor power or material possessions, I have therefore I am, but relationship with others. I relate, therefore I am. I encounter, therefore I am. Sorry, Rachel, I had to anticipate. Next year. Recall the wisdom of the little prince's search for friendship, and the wisdom of the fox with respect to the time spent relating and caring for others. Regretfully, we seem to live in a world all too often characterized by the fear of others and our failure to take time out, our busy schedules, to create cultures of encounters. The following quote characterizes our fallen and contemporary state of our family's lack of communion. And this comes from Sisoulas. Quote, in our culture, protection from the other is a fundamental necessity. We feel more and more threatened by the presence of the other. We are forced and even encouraged to consider the other as our enemy before we can treat him or her as our friend. Communion with the other is not spontaneous. It is built upon fences which protect us from the dangers implicit in the other's presence. We accept the other, sure. We accept the other only insofar as he or she is useful for our individual happiness. The fact that the fear of the other is pathologically inherent in our existence results in the fear not only of the other, but of all otherness. Radical otherness is anathema. Difference itself is a threat. That this is universal and pathological is to be seen in the fact that even when difference does not in actual fact constitute a threat for us, we reject it simply because we have distaste or dislike it. Paralyzing fears, huh? Within the United States, other voices echo similar arguments that address the suppression of human differences. For instance, responding to the marginalization of cultural differences in particular communities of faith, Latino theology in the United States emerged over 25 years ago in answer to the fundamental question, who am I? Who are Latinos as a people of God in the United States of America? Virgilio Elizondo pioneered this emergence with his reflections on mestizaje, and in particular the Galilean and mestizo-like identity of Jesus. Elizondo's writings offered an analogical parallel between Mexican Americans as a people who suffered marginalization as both insiders and outsiders within dominant U.S. cultures, and Jesus' own marginalization and identity as insider, outsider, and as a person sharing in both human and divine natures. In his writings, Elizondo understands mestizaje as the beginning of a new Christian universalism. He argues, quote, Christianity saw itself living out a new universal law that would not be limited by cultural or religious boundaries. For Elizondo, Christianity includes incarnational and transcendental dimensions of love. He associates the incarnational dimension with the fact that love and grace have many cultural expressions. He associates the transcendental dimension of Christianity with the fact that this love and grace also transcend any particular culture, thereby opening each culture to learn from the wealth and riches of the other. Echoing the central theme in Latino theology to address issues of diversity, power, and inequality, other Latino theologians have questioned how dominant social groups can often marginalize persons and ideas associated with particular underrepresented cultural, racial, and gender communities. While strongly arguing for respect and reconciliation of all human differences, Latino theology embraces the preferential option for the poor and marginalized. This preferential option maps the conditions necessary for realizing oneness out of a more inclusive community of persons. In this sense, this option makes clear that the realization of unity within any social or ecclesial body cannot be fully achieved until those most in need exercise active and participatory membership in the many. Attentive to the ways power asymmetries, privilege, inequality, and human-like conditions affect notions of communal unity, diversity, and belonging, Latino theology offers its own version for realizing the American ideal of oneness out of the many. Latino theologians have been critical of the way difference discourse often excludes those who have little or no access to power. The postmodern absolutization of particularity and otherness, that is, the particularity of some over the many, only adds to this practice of exclusion. When this happens, those in power refuse to own their difference and confuse their particularity with universality. As a way to challenge these false assumptions, Carmen Nanco Fernandez offers a perceptive answer to the question of human identity by focusing on notions of hybridity and multiple belonging. For her, it is no coincidence that the question of imago Dei, the image of God, is being raised in the heart of a hybrid United States by a polychromatic, polyglot, multi-ethnic, translocal community of scholars seeking to articulate the multiple intersecting contexts that form the basis of fluid identities in relationship. raising issues related to the exclusion of some from the many, Nanco Fernandez comments, and I quote, "Explorations of hybridity and multiple belonging must also include sustained conversation regarding multiple fitting and not fitting in. Who gets left out in our constructions of identity and community? Who resides on our margins when we omit or ignore the stories of our intersections? Who is ostracized based on arbitrary criteria determining the norm? Who is privileged and who is excluded when a particular norm is assumed as common? Who is silenced? Who loses agency? Who are the gatekeepers controlling access?" All questions of power and privilege. Conclusion. Some years ago, I reflected in one of my chapters for one of the books, edited books, on an often cited aphorism within Latino cultures. Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres. Tell me who you walk with, and I will tell you who you are. The aphorism answers the question of human identity in light of accompaniment. The time we spend walking and caring for each other, especially when we walk with those most in need. This year-long series here at Dominican University focuses on the question of who are we now? Who we are called to become now is who we are called to become always. Persons created to live in the image of God, albeit in an ever-complex, globalized, and diverse world. Our American principle at Pluribus Unum invites us to embrace the rich diversity that surrounds us in ways that continue to realize a more perfect union. To realize this more perfect union, we must strive for greater inclusion. We must foster, in the words of Pope Francis, a culture of encounter that actively and creatively seeks to include those who sit in the margin. But the Pope writes with respect to hospitality within the ecclesial body must shape, mutatis mutandis, our audacity to hope in what is yet to come. And I quote Pope Francis. Instead of being just a church that welcomes and receives by keeping the doors open, let's try also to be a church that finds new roads, that is able to step outside itself and go to those who have quit or are indifferent. The ones who quit sometimes do it for reasons that, if properly understood and assessed, can lead to a return. But that takes, the Pope says, audacity and courage. Striving to realize a more perfect union is not only our duty as citizens of this great nation, but also our obligation as women and men of faith. In fact, realizing a more perfect union or communion with all our neighbors is our God-given call. As I have discussed above in my remarks, we, the people, were created from a common origin to exist for and from others. In the image of the triune God, we are persons, that is, relational beings who become with others. Analogous to the life of God, we build authentic communities when we practice inclusion, when we give to and receive from others. Our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters also share the respect for human differences and the notion of fostering unity out of many. In similar ways, contemporary Jewish and Muslim thinkers have underscored that, quote, it is only through interaction that a person, and by extension any community or nation, grows and becomes itself, end of quote. And that's from a Christian view of Islam. Religious leaders like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Muhammad Talbi, or Miroslav Volf to name but a few, have emphasized the need to practice human agency within a diverse web of human relations, especially in the area of interfaith actions. These religious leaders move away from an abstract and sentimental understanding of love and instead invite diverse human hearts to join together in meeting the concrete needs of the world around us. Thus, Miroslav Volf argues that, quote, properly understood, love is not a soft and nebulous emotion, but a tough, practical virtue of benevolence and beneficence, a virtue of which justice is an absolute integral part, end of quote. In this talk tonight, I have reflected upon the theological significance of our American principle, e pluribus unum, as a way to affirm not only what we as Americans value to be one of the greatest foundational principles of this nation, but also what can be perceived from the eyes of faith as the most basic belief derived from our Christian Trinitarian faith. Oneness is diversity. Standing on the shoulders of giants like St. Thomas Aquinas, Averroes, and Maimonides, all of us have the responsibility to retrieve the positive contributions of the Andalusias of the past. El Andalus. I spent 3 weeks in Andalusia a couple of years ago and saw the rich interactions of Jewish, Christian, Muslim, as well as the negative history, of course. Together with others, even with those with whom we might significantly disagree on various issues, we must continue to co-create new recipes in the earthly cities we inhabit for the sake of advancing the common good. This common good cannot be realized in its fullness until the human family inhabits the city of God. Only in this heavenly city will the principle e pluribus unum come to full human realization. Then we will become a people with other people. And we will experience more fully in this community with others the oneness that comes from communion in God's triune life. Until then, let's get to work. Thank you.
Much to integrate, your ability to think about our country's documentary heritage and connect it and juxtapose it to Trinitarian theology and biblical theology is very impressive, so thank you. We have some time now for question and answer, so as our minds synthesize all that we've heard tonight, I invite people to come. We have a mic on both sides of the chapel, and please let's continue to engage this great mind amongst us. Thank you.
Yeah, I should say, obviously part of the history of our country is both grace and sin, of any country. So, it's also the story of creation. So
I'll just try and speak up, so not to make it to the mic, but I was very intrigued by your idea at the beginning of your talk about playfulness. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you might speak a little bit more about the role of playfulness in helping us realize this reality of diversity is oneness.
Well, I mean, and I borrow that notion from Phyllis Tribble's study of Genesis, the Genesis text, but it's just basically because of literary approaches to the text. We can't fail to notice the playfulness of is male, female, and so sometimes we need some joy and playfulness. We take serious. We carry this tremendous. I love Pope Francis at times is common saying, it's like we're people of the resurrection. We're people of, we gotta stop this kind of somber mood. Everything is bad in the world. The cultures are bad. Everything is bad. And so sort of like, stop, where's grace? Before there's original sin, there's original grace. So yeah, we can't deny the fact that there is oppression, that there is marginalization, that there is injustice. But, there's also grace that helps overcome those conditions. And so for me, the playfulness suggested in the book of Genesis is it's an invitation for us to understand the mutuality that ought to exist among all human persons, regardless of human condition.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I had a thought about the United States maybe being a kind of a laboratory, in the sense that we are so different that the difference might destroy the unity. On the other hand, the difference could produce a Pluribus Unum.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if in the natural order of things, we might be a laboratory that really could, living properly, attain a Pluribus Unum.
Yeah.
Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so during my tenure of service as the American ambassador in Rome, under Secretary Clinton, a video was produced by the State Department for all U.S. embassies, which I thought was incredibly effective. What the video did was it just used, so it has the song America the Beautiful, and it goes throughout the country. And all the video does is it places one sentence in the mouth of Americans who come from various walks of life. I'm an American. I'm an American. So you have an African American, a Latino American, a Cuban American, a Mexican American, an Asian American, an Irish American, and it keeps bombarding that I'm an American. So we used it throughout the U.S. embassies in various parts of the world, and I thought it was very effective because it's sort of like when I arrived as the first Latino and the first Catholic. You're the first U.S. Hispanic, but I'm an American with a Hispanic American background. This is partly how America looks. You got to stop destroying. I was mentioning to Rachel, the other thing that happened was during the first few months during my tenure, the Italians were like, "Ma questo non è possibile, l'ambasciatore americano parla italiano." This is impossible, the American ambassador speaks Italian. Of course, the stereotype that as Americans, we might not speak other languages. But I think that laboratory you speak about is something that has yet to be realized. I mean, we have yet to grasp onto its potential fully, because many times we do turn difference into division. And we know that at this moment in our history, Washington is paralyzed as a result of polarization and division. We have to overcome that. Because when we are able to turn that around and see the great fruits that can come about, not only for ourselves, but for the rest of, then it's truly something worthy of, a story worthy of being narrated.
I teach here at the Dominican seminar course, sophomore seminars on the plurality of religions. And an experience I have is when the students first gather into the class, they are very clear in their understanding that they are one and I am the other. Then we have these fancy, we have the clickers, fancy program where you can get anonymous opinions from everybody. And I ask about their various religious beliefs. And they are absolutely astonished that they are diverse.
See?
And all of a sudden I don't become the other. She said, everybody's the other. And that's a very difficult time within the course. But in dialogue, they start to become astonished that even though they are different, they are the same. So in your presentation saying that oneness is not sameness,
Right.
it's diversity. The way to evolve that and get that into consciousness is through dialogue. And it is very hard to get the bottom line culture, what's the answer? This is it. To students and to adults, that it is not only just American, I think it's human, that we want oneness to be sameness.
Right.
Without taking the time to go deeper into dialogue.
And it is an idolatry, right? I mean, from a theological perspective, at least a Christian theological perspective, we affirm that this tremendous diversity which God says is very good is in the image of God. But then we turn that around and we want everyone else, so it's creation and creatures in the image of God, but then it's idolatry. Then we want everyone to be in our image.
Yes.
So I am in God's image, and everything else has to conform to, and that's the line that I had there in terms of the particularity becomes universalized. And so we're no longer able, in our Aristotelian sense of the term, see the particular as mediator of the universal. No, what we have is my particularity becomes the universality in the universal.
And that, I agree with what you say, and I just say we struggle with it. Trying to get this understanding to be clearer at a deeper level than just intellectual.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that that's why I think conversation, dialogue, is such an important dimension, because it does bring about that giving and receiving. Because there is that tendency always to the othering. So we make the other, and then like Sisula's writes, then difference becomes division. Because we can't tolerate someone who is in the image of God, but wait, that can't be in the image of God. Wrong image. Yeah. Oops, something happened.
Doctor, in a little different direction here, if you would kindly comment on the description in the program. I'm intrigued with you being described as a bridge builder between government and civil society, and you leading an effort on the working group of religion and foreign policy, and that somehow the result of this was the government, the State Department, taking seriously the role of religion
in foreign policy,
and religious actors in the formulation and implementation of foreign policy. Could you give some concrete examples of how that actually happened? And what the result of that effort was?
Yeah, so here's what happened. So Secretary Clinton had established 5 groups of dialogue with civil society. One of the groups was religious leaders and religious agents in dialogue with civil society. During the time that I was during my time of tenure as ambassador, from day one, because of my theological and religious interests, I noticed that, we train our Foreign Service officers in language, culture, history, economics. We have a great Foreign Service Institute, especially in languages. It's awesome, really, in Washington. But one of the areas that I and others have known it's lacking is training in religion and the role of religion in society. And so I started to call, among other voices, to see what we could do to augment this area. When Secretary Clinton formed this group on religion and foreign policy, I was named as co-chair of the development and humanitarian assistance subgroup of this group. And my charge in the group that I was working with was to, at the international level, this is not at the domestic level, but at the international level, try to engage religious leaders and their ideas to more effectively deliver humanitarian assistance worldwide and deal with issues of development. That was at the international level. At the State Department level, I participated in a number of, from Rome, via video, and also came to the State Department, participated in a number of sort of like turning the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See as a kind of classroom, whereby I shared and used the U.S. Holy See relationship as a test case. I shared ways that the government could collaborate with religious leaders to advance U.S. foreign policy. And then tried to argue why it was important for Foreign Service officers to understand the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite, or a Coptic and a Roman Catholic, or Latin American Catholicism versus Catholicism in Africa, and how those ideas in those cultures impacted political and social actions. And one of the things that I constantly, never tired of saying, is like, we may have a separation of church and state, and some of us in this country may even have a very, very, very tight, wall separating those two, but that's not how other societies think. And so if we're going to carry foreign service in other societies, we have to understand the relationship between religion and society, religion and culture in other places, so that we may more effectively carry on our foreign policy. And so I became involved with that. This group is still in existence. It's Sean. There's a new person that Secretary Kerry named. Casey is his name. And so I'm still part of that initiative. I don't know where it will go, but our idea was that the initiative would become part of the structure of the State Department, so that regardless of who's in the White House, this structure could impact the education in terms of religion and society of entry foreign service officers as well as ambassadors, and provide ambassadors with resources in the area of religion and society in different parts of the world. So that was the initiative.
Any questions? Yeah.
First of all, the point about the lack of religious training, I reviewed a book almost 25 years ago called Religion Missing Dimensions.
Yes, that's Stacecraft, yes.
Worried about that.
Yeah. And Madeleine Albright, in her book, also calls it, this has to be something taken into consideration, yeah.
My question had to do perhaps with maybe the sin and grace, maybe also with the question of differences, a different perspective. Cynthia Crysdale wrote an article quite a while ago. I found very helpful about. She's talking about men and women, basically, but it pertains to other issues as well. And she distinguishes different kinds of differences. And her concern is that we treat all differences
the same.
As complementary. She said, well, some differences are actually developmental. Somebody who knows algebra is not quite the same as somebody who knows calculus, but it's a matter of development. One can move from one to the other, one horizon to the other. It's a developmental difference. And then there are many that are complementary perspectives on a house and so on. And that point, she says that certain underrepresented groups really have something to say. Their voices need to be heard. Those are complementary voices. But then she's concerned about certain differences that should not be celebrated. Because there's no middle ground. It calls for some kind of conversion. And at least sometimes listening to you, it sounds like it's just too quick to think that all these differences you're talking about are complementary.
Right.
And I just wonder if you have some kind of distinction or some kind of criteria to help us to distinguish when certain kinds of differences really are problematic and need to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think that's where you talked about sin and the grace piece. So what is life-giving? What leads to integration? What leads to disintegration? And I think that that might be a way to theologically at least begin to distinguish those differences. So no, it is not. It is not a good difference if I want to kill my neighbor. Exercise violence. So there are certain differences that are not to be celebrated in that sense because they're expressions of our fallen rather than our grace-filled nature. So.
I guess I'd follow up to say it's not an ethicist of sorts.
Right.
It's not so easy to sort those things out.
No.
It takes some patience. And many of the things I think that split us ideologically are on that fault line. Trying to figure out, what person says life giving, and the other person is not.
Right. So there again, there is no blueprint, to being able to discern, because you're right. I mean, the question then becomes, what are the criteria for establishing what is life-giving within, within one group or two groups or three groups, because someone may say, well, this is life-giving for the nation, and another group may say, well, this is not life-giving for the nation, and then we end up in polarization, right? And so clearly, I acknowledge the fact that, and especially, this is where diplomacy comes into play, because there were many instances in which, there were two different groups, whether at the national level or regional level in Europe or across the globe, which that may have very different approaches to X, Y, and Z. And I think that the compromise dialogue, the ability to give and to receive, the ability to meet the other, bridge those differences, to meet the other, whereby it's not my way or the highway. I mean, those are things that begin to help us overcome in circumstances where, we're clearly two different groups or persons have very different ideas, those obstacles. So, I do think that in some ways we all have to put on the hat of diplomacy. We all have to be diplomats in the sense of bridge builders, because whenever two or three humans are gathered, there are going to be differences. And sometimes those differences are going to be more significant and have greater consequences than others. And so, but it's the point is well taken. There has to be also an acknowledgement of the different within the difference. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate your use of Dime con quien andas, de quién eres, because it's kind of revealing to me, because the way I have been hearing it in my context is not as positive as the one that you're expressing. The expression more sounds like when the Pharisees were talking to Jesus, why are you with these people? In a sense, the context I have been in, tell me with whom you are and I will tell you who you are, is at least in my context, it's a much more negative kind of thing. It's like I have to judge you by with whom you are, and then your companies will tell you who you really are, but not in the sense of your solidarity with other people and all this kind of thing, but just by if you are with people I don't determine are accepted, are acceptable, then you are as not acceptable as they are. In the case of your comparison, definitely puts a new spin on it, and I will definitely use it for the future in any other situation.
Leave it to a Latino. We put new spins on everything. So.
So what is very interesting that normally you will say, okay, well this person, whatever we're talking, so dime con quien andas, look at that.
Right. And your interpretation is equally part of the. Of what sometimes it's part of the culture too. So yeah. I when I wrote that piece many years ago, it's actually from the heart of our people. When I wrote that piece, I was also in conversation with Roberto Goizueta and his theology of accompaniment. So when I wrote that piece, it was all about, in an effort to highlight within Latino communities, the whole notion of community relationship, the person as relational, etc. And so that's why the aphorism captured for me, what it meant to be a human person, to relate to others, to care for others. So.
I was thinking that sometimes when we talk about difference, we put a lot of emphasis on the ontological part of it. Like if it's something, difference is something that you have within you that you can touch, and you're coming from this original, authentic state. Even like using the words mestizaje, creoleness, they still imply not only the cultural and colonial background of any of those, but also this like ultimate necessity to arrive to a state of like absolute being in a way. So I guess the question is like, would you comment on ways in which we can stay away from this like idea that diversity it's something that it comes from first oneness and then interrelation with others, or maybe thinking about it more in terms of an exterior dialogue that is never ending, and you only get to be at the end of the road in a way, rather than starting being already one. I don't know.
Well, yeah. So what I would say is, even for me, the notion of mestizaje, which is a little different than the way that Virgilio Elizondo used it, for me it would be, as a metaphor, it would be in reference to the human person, to the interracial, intercultural, interreligious history of relations. But notice that my emphasis would be on relations, which is not. I didn't have time to develop this in this paper, but one of the things that the folks like Sociulas and others, I studied under Catherine Lacuna, and so the influence of an ontology of person vis-a-vis an ontology of nature is very big in me. And so the person is a dynamic being that is constantly being reconstituted as a result of entering new relations and encountering new beings. And so in that sense, this is not a static reality, but an ecstatic reality. We are never a fait accompli, and I did cite the French on that. And so we're in a process. This is a wonderful human project that with every new person, you have just changed me and I have changed you. We constantly, it's an exponential reality that we're constantly transformed and changed as a result of our of ongoing relating to, ongoing giving and receiving from another. And so yes, in that sense, then our oneness too is ever changing, because in the sense that that our nation has been transformed, and the oneness of our nation is also in a dynamic flow. It's not that we can say this is what it was and it was the same today. And so oneness corresponds then to the diverse piece and to the many piece. The many are changing, and so is the oneness. So.
I'm curious about, you mentioned a few minutes ago the uniqueness of the American ideal of a sharp wall between church and state. And that unique.
In some circles, that's not a thing.
Or perhaps a Western ideal. But I'm curious about that notion of secularity, because one of the striking things, it seems to me, for many about the combination of the Trinitarian reading of Pluribus Unum is that Pluribus Unum has that root of secularity, that sense of no official religion. Mm-hmm. And I find in many cases, we're speaking primarily with students, and we see the rise of students in younger generations seeing themselves as more spiritual
and not religious, yeah.
Without finding a specific religion. And they often see, it seems to me, as we talk about interfaith cooperation, and a sense that there is this religious strife in the world, but for many students and for many people, I suppose, they seem to feel that it is the religion itself that is causing the strife, and that they who see themselves as more generally spiritual, or maybe even without religion, have more of a place in that. That religion has too much of a voice in the public square. And I wonder, so at the end, and as you're speaking about reaching out, where, if you could speak a little more about where you see, in a pluralistic notion of a society, this space for those who see themselves as either non-believers or maybe more generally spiritual rather than aligned with a particular tradition.
Okay, so this is a Catholic theologian who has been deeply impacted by the theology of Karl Rahner and Ignatian spirituality, who's going to answer now, right? So, and now we have a pope who's also a Jesuit, and so if you have noticed in a number of cases, the pope has very clearly expressed the Ignatian spirituality in his speeches. He has, he says, well, to find God in all things. To find and to embrace and to seek God in all things. That to me has been a very formative principle, because I really think that that's ultimately Rahner's. Karl Rahner will argue that Ignatius of Loyola is his most most formative mentor in that sense. He's a good Jesuit in that sense. And I've always joked, I said, it's the Spaniards who influenced the Germans, in that sense. Because there is that sacramentality about the Ignatian/Ranerian and my reading of a Pluribus Unum. So it is my attempt also to say that what is secular may not be so secular, because ultimately what is most authentically human is also theological. Because Runner will argue that for all eternity, anthropology is theology as a result of the incarnation. And so in his Foundations of Christian Faith, he will say, as a result of the incarnation, anthropology is forever, Christology, and Christology is anthropology. I take that very seriously, that the human belongs eternally with God. Now, I know that that's my Christian reading, so the people, I have to allow for the space and respect for those that really believe that, that the space is just purely secular as you're using and has no theological dimension. I think we need to allow that from the table. But as a Christian theologian, I don't want to get into the whole complex issue of an anonymous Christian and all that, because we've all known that it's complicated and it's not easily resolved. But as a Christian theologian, I also want to affirm that with Ronner, a world of grace. That existence and history and everything that is always exists in the offer of grace. And so in that sense, I try to, as much as possible, find the theological dimension in the most secular of all secular activities. And I think that's also, Runner said that the Christian of the future would be a mystic or would not be a mystic at all. Seriously, we either discern the Spirit in everyday life and in our everyday actions, etc., or, so he said that we are just sleeping mystics awaiting to be, to rise to the presence of God all around us. I much rather have that vision than a vision that separates the secular and the profane from the holy. I could be wrong, and those of us that are in that camp may in the end be wrong, but I think that there's to live in the moment when, to live daily and to live constantly with the expectation that God comes in the whisper. The Pope has said this, in some of his comments, that God comes, in the ordinary experiences, is something worthy of. And so that's what I would say. I totally agree that in a pluralistic society, we must be respectful. Totally respectful of those who hold different religious perspectives, and also those who may not see with what I'm just describing now, and that's okay. But if I see their most authentic humanity as theological, without imposing this view on them, then I can cooperate, because I can engage, I can construct for the sake of our commonality. So.
One final question.
Okay.
I think you've already touched on that pluralistic aspect. So for you, oneness is diversity, or because we're reading a book called Encountering God by Diana Ackley, and you read it, and then she describes the difference between diversity, which is merely acknowledging the fact that we have differences, and plurality, which is that understanding that you touched on already. So that pluribus unum, is that unum diversity to you, or?
Well, the unum is oneness.
Oneness,
right. And then the pluribus is the many. Now, you're making a very fair distinction between diversity and difference, which I think it's fair enough, and different authors will use. That's why you have to go to each author to see how they're using these words, because these words are not always, you have to really, one has to acquire a sense of specificity for each of these words, because each author will use it in a different, each author will have its own take on these words. But my reading is very much impacted by, I hardly ever in my writings use the word separation. I always use the word distinction, for instance. And so I prefer to use words like distinction, because they have the kind of Trinitarian flavor that the divine persons are distinct, yet no divine person could be who he or she is apart from the other. And so that's the kind of richness that is of difference that I find in the life of God, that I think is that we were created from, and that we are called to, in the best sense of the term, to embrace as creatures in the image of God. And so, for me, it has to do not with sameness, as we were talking. It has to do with the preservation of the distinct gifts, charisms, ability to contribute to the common good that each one of us has in each of our own distinct ways of being human. So. Thank you.